What an incredibly flattering introduction that was. It is so nice to be here with all of you today. Why are there so many useless and often dangerously flawed AI systems? This is the question that inspired this book that I was very lucky to edit and write with a remarkable group of experts last year. Not a week passes by without some research paper, article, or product marketing making exaggerated or even entirely unlikely claims about the capabilities of artificial intelligence. Here's an example just from last year. It is categorically impossible to predict your political beliefs from your face. Just to showcase how bizarre this very premise is, what happens if my political beliefs change? Does my face change? It absolutely doesn't make sense. From academic papers that claim AI can predict criminality, personality, or sexual orientation, to the companies that sell these supposed capabilities to the police, to border control, to human resources departments around the world, fake and deeply flawed AI is rampant. In fact, as the computer scientist Arvind Narayanan, who I've had the pleasure to interview for this book, says, much of what is commercially sold as AI today is actually snake oil, meaning we have no evidence that it works, and based on everything we know and our scientific understanding of the domain, we have strong reason to believe that it can't possibly work. Here's the challenge, however. Not all AI is fake AI. In fact, the reason why we're talking about AI is that there has been a remarkable and genuine progress with some AI techniques in the past decade. For narrowly defined tasks, such as recognizing objects, AI is now able to perform at the same level, if not better, than humans. This really is remarkable, but it's also where the misunderstanding begins. For example, just because AI can recognize objects doesn't mean that it's ever possible to detect more complex or messy emotions. What's the root cause of this phenomenon? How are we complicit? And what can we do to tackle it? I want you to walk away from this talk with much more confidence and a much better radar for detecting and calling out AI pseudoscience, snake oil, and hype whenever you see it. And I also want you to understand why we're seeing so much dangerously flawed AI in recent years. Before we dive into this very strange universe of false marketing, bad engineering, and bigoted ideas, I want us to take a really deep breath. Yesterday, someone tweeted that they felt overwhelmed to be here and that they had to leave. And I very much get that. I'm finding it impossible to talk about anything these days without acknowledging how very uncertain and fragile the world feels right now. So why am I talking about AI when so much is happening in the world that requires our undivided attention? The reason why I'm talking about fake AI is that fake AI results in real, tangible harm. And this harm disproportionately affects people who are already marginalized, who are invisible, who are being discriminated against. As Deborah Raji wrote an essay for this book said, there are bodies under the rumble of collapsing AI systems. So let's take another deep breath and let's explore and unpack this puzzle together. The first phenomenon I want to talk to you about is the phenomenon of hype. In 2019, a study showed that 40% of all European AI startups don't actually use AI. The London-based venture capital firm that conducted this study with over 2,300 startups in 30 countries concluded In 40% of cases, we could find no mention or evidence of AI being used at all. As a caveat, the claim that these startups are AI companies doesn't necessarily come from the companies themselves. But what the study shows is that there are very clear incentives for companies to not correct this misconception. There's also a second finding of the studies. When companies do deploy AI and machine learning, the use cases are often incredibly banal. So they're either using chatbots or fraud detection. What this shows are three things. First of all, there is, or at least there was, a real hype around AI. Secondly, companies are taking advantage of this hype. And finally, they're being rewarded for this hype. Part of this has to do with language. It's clear that AI has become a completely elusive term that doesn't really have a meaning anymore. We know what AI means on a technical level. It's an umbrella term used to describe a range of techniques, such as machine learning. But in the public imagination, the term AI has taken on a meaning of its own. Surveys show that the public at large seems to believe that general artificial AI, that is, the ability of an intelligent agent to understand or learn any task that a human being can, is just around the corner. Very few experts believe that this is the case, and nonetheless, this is a commonly held belief. So part of this has to do with hype. As Gemma Mine, who wrote an essay for this book, argued, hype is a tool for capturing attention. It's also a little bit like a magic show. Hype exaggerates expectations, and it makes us feel strong emotions such as excitement or fear. Basically, hype is a blessing and a curse. We all live in the attention economy. If you're associating yourself with hype technology, you're attracting funding, attention, sales. So if you're a journalist, an NGO, a politician, we're all complicit or guilty of using hype. What's so strange about the phenomenon of fake AI is that in many ways, we are already on the downward cycle of the AI hype cycle. And we've seen this really clearly in the pandemic. So a technology that has been hyped as a solution for virtually every challenge imaginable, curing cancer, fighting poverty, predicting criminality, had a remarkably minor role to play in the global response to a very real challenge, which is the pandemic that we're still finding ourselves in. So as we're on this downward slope of the AI cycle, this is a really unique moment to take stock and reflect on what are the root causes between the rise and fall of AI hype. So here's our first lesson about fake AI. Just because something is called AI doesn't mean it's AI. And also, we're all complicit in creating and sustaining hype. Let's talk about some of the other ways in which we can identify fake AI. And more specifically, I want to talk about snake oil. The term snake oil originates from the US from the mid-19th century, when Chinese immigrants working on the railroads introduced their American counterparts to an oil-based treatment for arthritis. The effectiveness of the oil created a very lucrative market, and quickly sellers, unscrupulous sellers, sold all kinds of remedies which contained either inferior oils or random ingredients, essentially. Today, the term snake oil has taken on a very prerogative meaning and essentially means false marketing. Why are we so susceptible to AI snake oil? I don't know about you, but I'm very sure, or I'm not entirely sure if everything in my bathroom or everything that I put on my face actually does what it says it does. Companies that sell AI snake oil, they're doing much more than just exaggerating the capabilities of AI. Companies are overselling the capabilities in domains where we have absolutely no evidence that AI can work. And based on our scientific knowledge of the domain, we have strong reasons to believe that what they're promising couldn't possibly ever work. So this is the difference between snake oil and hype. Hiring is a domain where we see a lot of AI snake oil. This is a study by the excellent journalists at Bayerischer Rundfunk, Bavarian Broadcasting. The software they analyzed promised to identify personality traits of job candidates based on short videos. With the help of AI, they're supposed to make better hiring decisions. And crucially, the promise is that these decisions are more objective and fair. A data analysis of the software tool, however, showed that it's incredibly easy to manipulate. So what you see here, this is a journalist and their predicted personality. Here's the very same journalist with glasses and now a remarkably different personality. And finally, you see the same journalist wearing a headscarf with yet an entirely different personality that's being predicted. So cases like these are often discussed as examples of AI bias and discrimination. And don't get me wrong, what you're seeing here is incredibly discriminatory. But sadly, this is not even the main point. It's a textbook example of AI snake oil. A company markets a tool that simply doesn't do what it says it does. The tool isn't actually assessing candidates, it's assessing their outfits, and as the journalists found, it's also assessing the background of their videos. So let's go back to the definition of snake oil. What's fundamentally dubious about the example I just showed you is the very idea that AI can predict who we should hire, or that AI can predict anyone's personality based on a video alone. Who should we hire? Which kids might drop out of school? Who might be arrested for a crime in the future? These are all questions which are contingent on an incredibly broad array of factors that we have a hard time quantifying, and it's not clear if we ever will. So that's why more data, better algorithms will never help us solve these questions. So here we have it, another piece of the fake AI puzzle. We cannot predict the future, and AI cannot either. Whenever a company claims otherwise, that's a massive red flag and a clear sign that you might be dealing with AI snake oil. I want to look at another piece of the puzzle, and that is bad engineering. Deborah Raji, who works at the Algorithmic Justice League, and she also worked in a lot of applied machine learning teams, she also contributed an essay to this book. And I'm going to read a quote from this essay. And I think it's important that it comes from her since she worked in these teams. I've witnessed the model development process up close. It's a chaotic enterprise. The fact is, in this field, inattentive engineers often get away with it. No data reviews imposed, no reporting requirements, there's no sanctioned communication protocol, no safety culture to speak of, no best practices to adhere to, no restrictive regulation or enforced compliance, and crucially, no guide for recall, voluntary or imposed, to remove from our daily lives the models that cannot be steered, the algorithms that don't have brakes. So what Deborah Raji is doing here, she's comparing the way in which AI systems are often built to a long history of chronic disregard for safety in consumer protection, in building cars, in engineering. So bridges that don't hold, cars that can't steer. I think this is really insightful, and I encourage you to follow Deborah's work. But I also think what's so useful about this comparison is that it draws the attention to the real people who are affected. Here's Robert Williams, a Black man who was wrongfully arrested due to an incorrect facial recognition, quote unquote, match. I don't have a picture of them because it would be too many people to fit into one picture. But there are tens of thousands of victims of the Dutch childcare benefits scandal, where people on benefits were wrongly accused of fraud and received bills of fines of up to 100,000 euros. And it took years until this scandal was uncovered and mitigated. Here's another example of the real-world people who are affected by fake AI. These are the Indian farmers who've been protesting for over a year in 2020. They were protesting agricultural reforms, but they were also protesting an automated agri-tech platform by one of India's largest conglomerates. And in our book, there's an essay just on this topic alone. So there's another lesson for how to recognize and detect fake AI. Systems that don't work can cause far more harm than systems that do work. And I think that's really important to let that sit in. AI systems cause far more harm when they do not work than in the rare instances where they work too well. Another theme that Deborah describes is the tendency of the technical community to simultaneously anthropomorphize AI systems, so to make them like human, but also downplay the role of human participation in the development and in the decisions that shape AI systems. So this tendency is also evident in the way in which AI systems are trained and developed. We don't have time to go into all the details, but there's another essay in the book that I want to draw your attention to. And that's an essay on something called benchmark datasets. So in the machine learning community, benchmark datasets are used to assess and compare different AI algorithms. Performance against a benchmark dataset is often understood as research progress. And these datasets are typically seen as purely technical and purely objective. However, as we've seen through the very critical work of Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglen and others, this simply isn't the case. One of the most significant training datasets in the history of AI is ImageNet. ImageNet consisted of 14 million labeled images organized into more than 20,000 categories. So for over a decade, this dataset has been used to measure progress in the field. However, and this is why I love this example, it's one thing to label apple and bananas. It's something entirely different to name a person's profession, to see an image and say, this is a cheerleader, this is a cognitive neuroscientist, this is a bad person, this is a call girl, this is a drug addict, or an unskilled person. And what you see here, those are all images in this widely used data sets that were labeled failure, loser, non-starter, unsuccessful person. As you can see, labeling images with these words is inherently subjective. In my conversation for the book with the computer scientist Arvind Narayanan, he mentioned 2 wish list items for journalists who are often complicit in overhyping technology. So one is, please stop attributing agency to AI. AI doesn't do anything. It's the people who build the systems who are making the decisions. Here's another one. The other wish was that journalists will stop reporting on accuracy numbers. So whenever you see a study which says with 91% accuracy an AI can do something, be very critical, because this number just means a test against a benchmark, and this benchmark data set comes with its own limitations and history. I'm going to jump a little bit, so I'm a bit too slow. So here are 2 other lessons for us to learn about how to detect fake AI. AI doesn't have agency, the people who build it do, and accuracy numbers are rarely meaningful. I want to take the remaining time that we have to talk about pseudoscience, the core of fake AI. Who am I as data? This question has haunted me for years. I want to know how machines see me, and I want to know what my data shadows reveal about myself. And my curiosity with this question comes from a paradoxical societal shift. So on the one hand, we're living in a time when the ability to describe ourselves has become much more fluid and negotiable. While there's resistance, there's never been more space to describe your sexuality or your gender as fluid. At the same time, however, we're increasingly surrounded by data-driven systems that automatically attach labels to us. So here's an example. You may be gender non-conforming, non-binary or trans, but the gender binary is very much encoded into the systems that surround you, from online advertising to face recognition that prescribe gender. So AI systems that claim to detect identity always risk giving racism, transphobia, and sexism an appearance of scientific advancement and objectivity. This is an image from an essay by Sasha Konstanze-Chock, who has worked extensively on design justice and what it means to be traveling while trans. So that's one example where you're surrounded by a system that puts you into a category where you're rendered invisible. Here is another example. Last year, the BBC reported on a patent by the Chinese company Huawei for a system that identifies people who appear to be of Uyghur among crowds. All of these systems have three things in common. They're designed to detect deviations from the mean, and thereby they define what is normal and what isn't. They're intended to be, and often treated, as more reliable and trustworthy than the statement made by those that are being assessed. And finally, these predictions come with significant margins of error and completely eliminate those who do not fit into whatever arbitrary classification is being offered. And that's not because AI is not good enough yet, or because we need more data. It's because who we are isn't something that can be straightforwardly detected, like the color or the shape of an object. In reality, categories like race, gender, sexual orientation evolve over time, and they remain subject to contestation. They also remind us of a very dark time when these categories were imposed on people. So in our book, Abiba Birhane argues that dusty and long discredited ideas have found new legitimacy through AI. So the return of pseudoscience such as race science is neither unique nor distinct to AI. However, what is unique is that AI is giving these incredibly dangerous ideas the veneer of innovation, the appearance of progress. In our book, Abiba calls this cheap AI, and here's what she says. Cheapness emerges when a system makes it easy to talk at little or no cost to the speaker, while at the same time causing tangible harm to the most vulnerable, disenfranchised, and undeserved. So here we have another piece of the puzzle. AI, or using AI, doesn't turn pseudoscience into science. And finally, AI cannot and AI shouldn't predict your identity. So I talked about the many ways in which fake AI results in real, tangible harm. Or as Deborah Raji says, the bodies under the rumble. And how this harm disproportionately affects communities that are marginalized, excluded, discriminated, or invisible. There's another reason why all of this matters. We're living in a digitized and increasingly automated society. And we have a very short window of time to make sure that this world we're creating is not just livable, that people can't just survive, but that people can thrive. That this remains a world where we can protest, where we can resist, where we have the space to take on the biggest challenges of our time. Ultimately, I really do think resisting and protecting people from fake AI, pseudoscience, is about much more than making AI accountable, transparent, explainable, or less biased. This is about defending and vigorously protecting what it means to be a person. It's about resisting ontological reduction. It's about allowing space for identities to be challenged, to be contested, not cemented by unscrutable automated systems. There's also something else that is at stake. If we're unable to distinguish between real and fake AI, we really risk missing out on the many genuinely exciting things that you can do with AI. And we are seeing this resistance. So this is a sign, fuck the algorithm, from a protest in the UK where students were graded by an automated system and protested against it. So in conclusion, I do hope that you feel a little more confident in making a distinction between fake AI and AI, and in calling out pseudoscience, snake oil, and hype whenever you see it. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this presentation, it's this, and this is why I put it on the slide. We are definitely not heading towards general AI. We are not locked in an AI race that can only be won by countries with the least regulation and the most investment. Instead, the real advances in AI pose both old and new challenges that can only be tamed if we see AI for what it really is. Namely, a powerful technology that at present is produced by only a handful of companies with workforces that are not representative of those who are disproportionately affected by its harms. And I want to end this with a beautiful poem by Serena Dokua-Oduro, who wrote this poem for our book. And I don't want to read it out loud. I'm giving you time to read it. But I want to highlight one sentence, and that is, there is no mechanical solution. There's only the purposeful striving towards justice. I would like to thank the brilliant contributors who all participated in this book. Follow their work, promote their work. They're all incredible thinkers, worth reading and listening to.